Hello and welcome to the channel. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through part one of a multi-part series. It'll likely be 3 parts, where I'm going to talk about enterprise Power Apps and Power Automate governance. And where this is coming from is I recently did a presentation at the Microsoft Calgary office, and there were some folks that couldn't actually make the event, so they were asking if this was going to be recorded, and I figured why not, I will record it and put it on the channel. So let's go ahead, let's dive into part one of Enterprise Power Apps and Power Automate Governance. In the event that you're new to the channel, here's a brief introduction about myself. So I am a senior manager. I lead enterprise architecture, integration, and power platform teams at an energy company in Canada. I am a Microsoft Flow, or I guess now it's changed, it's Power Automate MVP. I was previously part of the Power Automate, or at the time Microsoft Flow product group, where I was responsible for enterprise readiness. Outside of work and these MVP activities, I'm also a published author, and I am a cloud and emerging technology editor at infoq.com. It's a technology publication, so go ahead and check that out if you're looking for the latest news in cloud technology. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to be part one of a multi-part series, and so what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on secure. In subsequent videos, we'll talk about monitor and alert in action. And just so you know where some of this content came from, I gave a presentation with James Olenek from the Power Apps team back last spring at the Business Application Summit. So certainly some of this content you're going to find today was from that presentation. So when we talk about security and securing the Power Platform, naturally tenants and environments play a huge role in how we go about securing our overall solutions. Now, to begin with, it starts at the tenant. So if we take a look here on the slide, we've got Contoso Corp, which essentially is our tenant. Now, if you are in an Office 365 environment or even a Power Platform environment, you have a tenant. And at this point, generally organizations have one. Some may choose to have multiple. They might have a test tenant and a dev tenant, but generally you might have just one. Now, what governs that tenant is certainly Azure AD, and this is where your user principal names or UPNs come from, which are often referred to or linked to your username, and that's how you access any of these services inside of your tenant. Now, what we have the ability to do is to create environments inside of that tenant. Now, every tenant will have a default environment, and that's represented here by that Contoso EMEA prod environment is considered the default environment. So what that means is every user in your tenant has access to that environment. And at this point, there's no way that you can actually limit that. They automatically get added to that environment. Part of the reason for that is certainly you've got experiences around, say, SharePoint, where you want to be able to call a flow. And you want to be able to call that by clicking on a button inside of the SharePoint ribbon, or it could be OneDrive for Business. By having this default environment, it ensures that those services and those first-party integrations don't break, because the user will click the button and know that they actually can build that flow and execute it. Now, certainly as you deal with multinational organizations, you're going to want to create environments in specific regions. And certainly you don't want data to leave that region, and as a result, that's why you would go ahead and create that environment in that region, and then you can be assured that the data will stay within that region. It's also a good idea to have multiple environments, much like in your on-premise world, you've got dev, test, production environments. You should do the same thing when it comes to the Power Platform. If you do have applications and solutions that are mission critical within the business, you want to have that place to be able to build and test in isolation, and once you're comfortable with the changes, you can go ahead and promote those to production and use these solutions and be confident about them being stable and not introducing bugs, that sort of thing. Generally, something I like to do is to rename my default environment Personal Productivity, and that implies consent or permission for end users to go ahead and use it for personal productivity purposes. If they do have solutions that require more rigor and need to go through IT change management, they should really be promoting these solutions into additional environments where you do have more control. An administrator can create an environment and then essentially have opt-in access for users that just need it. And that's one of the benefits of using environments. So in summary, environments are tied to a geographic location, and it's configured at the time that the environment is created. Environments can target different audiences or use cases. much like dev, test, prod, etc. DLP policies, data loss prevention, is something we're going to talk about in upcoming slides, but it can be applied to individual environments or the whole tenant, which is a really important feature. Every tenant does have a default environment, as we discussed. Non-default environments can be created by licensed Power Apps and Power Automate users, but also can be restricted. So this is a feature that's part of the new admin experience, where you can choose whether or not you want only administrators to be able to create environments. This is a feature, me personally, that I would suggest that you turn on. I don't like to have more environments. I think it creates more overhead when it comes to managing them. I think it's one of those things where, yes, you do need multiple environments, but if you have hundreds of them, I feel like you're just asking for problems when it comes to monitoring all of those environments and understanding how those environments are being used. Non-default environments offer more control around permissions. As I talked to you about that, you can choose which users can be added to a non-default environment, and it just gives you more control. And as I referred to on the previous slide, opt-in access, where you can opt different users in as opposed to everyone getting access to those non-default environments. So let's talk about the 5 layers of security. And then on the subsequent slide, we're going to talk about even another concept that's probably even more important than any of these 5 that we're going to talk about now. So much like any other cybersecurity strategy that leverages something called defense in depth, the Power Platform is no different. There is no silver bullet when it comes to securing your Power Platform assets. So the idea is you've got these different layers that you can rely upon to address different concerns that you might have. And you can choose to implement some, and others are going to be enabled by default. But the reality is that you've got multiple layers that you can actually depend upon to ensure your users are not going off the path that you want them to, and that your data remains secure inside of your tenant. So the first thing is, since Power Automate and Power Apps is built on top of Azure AD, that is the identity management system for these tools. One of the core capabilities of Azure AD is called conditional access, which allows you to provide policies on the devices that are being used when building and using these apps and services. The other thing is you can also choose network restrictions. So if there were specific regions of the world where you didn't want these services being used from, you also have the ability to enforce conditional access and limiting based upon network. So for example, only on your local network might be something you want to explore. The next is environment roles. In general, you've got 2 roles, makers and administrators. And then if you start to use CDS, then you've got much more roles, which we're going to talk about on bullet point 4, where we have a tremendous amount of control over data access when using the common data service. But in general, you've got maker roles who can go ahead and make these assets and share these assets out with other users. Obviously, you've got environments that we talked about previously, where you can restrict which environments these apps and services can run within. But in general, you do have those 2 roles. Naturally, the administrator has the ability to take over resources if required. And that really takes us into point number 3, where we have these resource permissions for apps, flows, custom connectors. So these are all assets that can be shared. And generally, you as a maker have the ability to choose who you share these things with. But it is important to know that an administrator can always add themselves to owners of these different resources. So for example, if someone left and there was perhaps an important application or solution that was being stranded, an administrator can opt themselves in, take it over, make any changes required to get that app or solution back up and running, and then transition ownership to another user. So do know that is an important feature of the platform. Next up, let's talk about CDS security roles. So certainly if you have experience in the Dynamics 365 Customer Experience Platform, or CRM, you will know that there are a lot of different roles that exist inside of CDS, and you also have the ability to create your own. So for example, and I think this is a great one, you might have some users who need to read data from the common data service. You might have some users that need to add data or to be able to append data. Well, you have a very granular control on how this happens by using security roles inside of CDS. This is one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of CDS, is because you do have this level of control. It's not as easy when you start to get into some other data sources, but using CDS is a great way to secure sensitive data for your organization, and I would highly encourage using it. Last up, let's talk about bullet number 5, which is cross-tenant inbound and outbound restrictions. Now, what you can do is you can go ahead and log a ticket with Microsoft if you're concerned about cross-tenant access to your resources. So let's talk about an example to explain this. We've got Contoso and we've got Fabricam. Now, in theory, what you can do is you could log into Contoso, you could create a flow, and as a result, you could create a connection to Fabricam. So let's say I, was trying to send email to my Fabricam account. I could go ahead and create a connection to it from Contoso and use the Office 365 Outlook connector and send an email action, and you create a connection to Fabricam and allow that information to flow out. But you can actually prevent this from happening, and it's through cross-tenant inbound and outbound restrictions, and you can prevent connections from being made to other AAD, Azure Active Directory resources outside of your tenant, and prevent the opposite from happening, a connection from being made from an outside tenant inside. And these are, when I say connections, these are still people putting in their credentials and doing so, but there may not be a good reason for doing it. When you have some subsidiary type scenarios, or you're in the middle of a merger and acquisition, there could be some very good reasons why you want to leave this open, but just do know that you do have the option to prevent that if that is something that you want to block. Now, most importantly is, beyond the 5 layers that we just talked about, the one that matters the most is that your data is still secure in your endpoint. So for example, if I do not have access to CDS or CRM, let's use CRM as an example. I don't have access to CRM. I can't just go ahead and create a flow and use the CDS connector to try to connect to that CRM CDS instance. It's just not going to happen. And then let's take the next example, and let's say I do have access to CRM and that underlying CDS instance. Perhaps I have read access. So if I go ahead and I create a connection using a connector to CDS, I can only do what that system is going to allow me to do. Power Apps nor Power Automate escalate privileges for me. They don't bypass privileges for me. It's using my permissions based upon what's dictated in that source system. And I think that's what people oftentimes miss when they get concerned about the Power Platform and what people can do. Yes, the Power Platform is extremely powerful, but you're not allowing a user to do something that they don't already have access to do. So one way I like to look at it is, what can that user do today through a web browser? Whatever they can do through a web browser, chances are they can do through Power Apps and Power Automate. But if I can't do something in this web browser, guess what? I'm not going to be able to do it inside of the Power Platform. And this is very important to understand, that you're not giving them the ability to do anything that they can't already do. So just please remember that as you're going through this material and thinking about your own security and governance strategies. All right, so here are some Power Platform environment principles. These are essentially my own opinions, so mileage may vary, but at least when I go ahead and I establish governance around the Power Platform, these are some of the things that I think about. So naturally, your company is spending time, money, resources on the Power Platform. It's best if you actually take advantage of it. Like if you're seriously trying to lock it down, I would clearly like to better understand your motivation, because what's good for your company through improved productivity should be good for you. So it's something to think about. Think about what is the business outcome that the organization is trying to achieve, as opposed to trying to lock something down because that's not the way you've done it in the past. So do empower people to be makers. Now, that's not just saying make everything wild and open. That's the whole point of all of this content, is it's how do you allow or put in those guardrails to keep people using these services but without going out of bounds and creating risk situations where data might be leaking, that sort of thing. And that's really, find that right balance between productivity and governance. And I think you'll probably be able to find a happy medium when you start to look at what are the demands of the business and what you can do to help enable them to be more productive. And The other thing is people also get hung up on like, oh, like this tool is for just business users. Doesn't have to be that way. I've seen organizations where IT pros heavily leverage this technology to automate their workloads. I also see cybersecurity teams that take advantage of these tools to automate their workloads. So this isn't just about the business. Also think about if you're in the IT department, how you can use this to drive outcomes as well. Another thing I'll say is incent the right behaviors. If you start to lock things down too tightly, you haven't actually solved the demand problem. The business is still going to try to find ways around these constraints, and that could be involving other tools, bringing in other tools that don't have the same level of governance that the Power Platform has. So you start to think about maybe some of the competitors out there. There's no Office 365 security and compliance logs. There's no DLP logs. There's no cross-tenant blocks in place. So you end up in a much more difficult situation than if you just listen to the demand and then actually figured out how you can go about solving any of those risks that you feel that are being introduced. Another thing I'll suggest is if you're new or early in your Power Platform journey, now is the time to act. It'll be much more difficult to pull tools away from your end users than it is to put in some base governance right off the bat. And so we're going to talk about it here shortly, but DLP is probably one of the first things that you should do. Another thing that you should do is figure out your environment strategy and how you want to go about creating environments and provisioning them and ensuring the right people have access to it. Because I don't think you want everyone building all of their production apps in your default environment. So that's something you should be really thinking about. Another scenario is like treat exceptions as exceptions. There are going to be some situations where a business unit might have some legitimate needs that go against some of your strategies. So for example, Twitter might be a connector that you want to block because you don't want to have corporate data leaving the environment and going off to Twitter. And that's a very natural and reasonable concern that you might have. However, if you think about a corporate communications group, their job is going to be communicating outside. And so this is where you may want to enable that Twitter connector for them so that they can actually go ahead and use it and actually automate their work. So that's a scenario where you may want to create an exception. It could be an environment. It could be some, automation or workflow using the management connectors, which we'll talk about later on in this course, where you can basically restrict what people can do and try to detect those exceptions and then see if people belong to a membership group and allow them to continue. But do be prepared for exceptions. It's probably something you want to create some sort of form intake. I would suggest using Microsoft Forms and Power Automate to help automate these requests, and then just be prepared for it because you will run into them and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all types of situation. Depending on the size of your organization, this might be a reasonable place to start from an environment perspective. So here we have the default environment. It supports personal productivity. You allow flows and apps to be built in this environment that connects to non-SOX systems. Now, what is SOX? So it's a Sarbanes-Oxley regulation, and so generally publicly traded companies in the US, and then we have something similar to it in Canada called CSOX. And so these are systems that require a lot more rigor to prove that you've got segregation of duties, to prevent fraud, things of that nature. So using this environment for productivity, tracking apps, those types of things is a great use case. Now, once you start getting into the solutions where you've got business units depending upon them, and maybe even a whole corporation depending upon them, you want to start adding more rigor to the process. You might have your test and production environments. You could also have a dev environment in there as well. And this is where you start to apply more rigor towards those environments and what people can do within them. For example, you may have less people that have access to the environment. You may have different DLP policies in place for these environments as well. And you might want to introduce your change control. So for example, like if you have a change board where production apps have to go through that process, then these would be candidates that if you wanted to get a app or solution in the production environment, that you need a change ticket and represent it at the change board. So the whole idea is you should start to create this strategy and hierarchy around how you want environments to be used, and then ensure you communicate those principles with your end users so that they can follow them. So let's now talk about preventing data leakage. And the way that you can do this is through data loss prevention policies, or what's known as DLP. Something to be aware of is that these are DLP rules for the Power Platform. These should not be confused with Office 365 DLP rules or Azure Information Protection DLP rules. These are specific to the Power Platform. Now do note that there's essentially two buckets. And what you can do is you can put connectors in one of these two buckets. The first being business data only, and the second being no business data allowed. Now, just because you put a connector in no business data allowed, that doesn't mean that that connector is disabled. It's still very much active. What these two buckets do is they prevent a connector from crossing boundaries. So all of these connectors in the business data only data group can communicate with each other. Similarly, all of the connectors in the no business data allowed bucket can talk to each other. But what they can't do is they can't talk across these different data groups or buckets that I've been referring to. So for example, we cannot have Microsoft Teams in the same flow as Dropbox. If we tried to create a flow that would use those two connectors in the same flow, that would actually be suspended. And we would get an error indicating that a DLP rule has been violated. But if I wanted to go ahead and create a flow that included the Office 365 Outlook connector and Microsoft Teams, that would be okay, no problem, because they're in the same data group. Similarly, I could go ahead and create a flow that included a Salesforce trigger and a Dropbox action, and that would be okay because these two connectors, Salesforce and Dropbox, are in the same data group. So typically how I've structured my DLP policies, I've put the connectors that we have the corresponding systems for in our business data only data group. So for example, all of the Microsoft first party connectors we put in here because we trust them. We use Office 365, we use Dynamics, and we use Azure. So all of those connectors go into this bucket. We also have some other services that we use from other reputable SaaS vendors, which we will include in this bucket as well, because once again, back to the analogy of what can a user do in a web browser, what can they do through automation, we're seeing those things as the same thing, and we'll allow those reputable SaaS connectors in that bucket as well. Now, what I also like to do is I take consumer-based services and I put them in the no business data allowed. So this is where you get into your Dropbox, even your Outlook.com and your OneDrive for personal use, they end up in the no business data allowed because I don't want to have data coming, corporate data coming from say Office 365 and then reaching a consumer-based service. So that's how I'll go ahead and separate these things. Now, do know that there's sort of two levels of scopes when it comes to DLP policies. The first is at the environment level. So I could create a policy that is specific to the default environment, and that could be fine. But what I can also do is I can create a tenant-wide policy. Now, I need to be either a Power Platform admin, a global admin, or a D365 service admin to do this. And then what we'll do is it will apply a single policy across all of the environments. So in the event that a new environment is introduced, it will automatically inherit that DLP policy. So that's a great place to start, is if you're just new to the Power Platform, create a default or create a tenant-wide DLP policy that you're comfortable with that gives you this base protection regardless of if new environments are created. Now, this is the experience when it comes to once you've created your DLP policy, you've separated your connectors into the different data groups. You can then choose, well, do I want to apply this to a specific environment or all environments, which essentially is the tenant-wide policy, or all environments except. So back to that rule about, say, corporate communications, maybe you created a separate environment for them, and you wanted that to be an exception environment. So you could have a tenant-wide DLP policy that applies to all environments except corporate communications, because there you're going to relax the rules for Twitter and allow the Twitter connector to be used with business data. Now, something to be aware of is that by default, the HTTP connectors are not included in DLP policies. But do note that there is essentially a mitigation for this, and that is that you can go ahead and create new DLP policies through PowerShell. And when you use this specific schema the new schema for that DLP policy, you can then manage the HTTP action, the HTTP request trigger, and then the HTTP webhook action. So what I would suggest you do is go check out this link. It gives you more details on this. Create all of your DLP policies using PowerShell. Then what happens is once you've done that, you can go back into the regular DLP editor that's part of the Flow Admin Center, and then you will see these additional connectors or action/triggers show up, and you can choose which data group you want to include them in. So I would go ahead, check out this link. This is very important. Similarly, custom connectors is important to understand its behavior. By default, custom connectors are managed by DLP policies, but, and the big caveat is but, when a custom connector is created, it will be put into the default data group, which is typically your no business data allowed data group unless you change it. So what happens is you might build a custom connector with good intentions, like this is a sanctioned connector, you want to be able to use this connector in a flow and use corporate data, but you're going to find out that you're going to have this DLP rule that's enforced, and you're kind of like, well, how do I change this? And so the key is the PowerShell commandlet called add custom connector to policy, which will then allow you to take this custom connector, reference a DLP policy, and then choose which data group you want to put it into. So you could put it into your business data only data group, and then when you do so, you can now manage that connector through the DLP editor experience. So the previous slide where I showed that link, that will also talk about DLP custom connectors, but this is important to know because the behavior is a little bit different than what you see out of the box, but rest assured you can still manage your custom connectors in DLP policies, and I highly recommend you putting them in the correct group so that you can actually enforce your DLP policies and prevent data leakage. Another tip related to managing security is use Azure AD Groups wherever possible. So some fairly recent or new capabilities is to actually provide group assignment through Azure AD Groups. So you can do this through the new admin portal experience, and you can create an Azure AD group for, say, your dev environment, create an Azure AD group for your test environment, create an Azure AD group for your prod environment. And then when you want to add users into those environments, just put them into those AAD groups, and then they'll automatically have the access they need. This is their base access that they need. So definitely use Azure AD Groups for environments. Another thing that you can do is take advantage of the Azure AD licensing feature, which also allows you to associate an Azure AD group to a license. So the organization I work for, we have grandfathered licenses. We use P1 and P2 licenses for Power Apps. And so when we're rolling out applications, we need to ensure that users have the right license so that they can use that app. So what we'll do is we create Azure AD Groups, and then we will, through a flow and a form process, we will then add the person into that related Azure AD group. They automatically then get assigned the license, and then we don't have to take care of manually doing that. Naturally, when you have a Power App, you can share it with an Azure AD group instead of managing it individually. So that's something you should absolutely be taking advantage of. And then another neat capability is when you do use Azure AD groups is you can use them inside of Intune. So perhaps you have essentially Intune, and that's how you roll out your corporate applications to corporate devices. Well, you can use this same methodology for deploying the Power Apps and Power Automate applications. And you can do so by associating it to a group. And when you do that, automatically that app will be rolled out. So by planning your deployments, you can actually simplify the end user experience when you want them to use that new app. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, we're rolling out this new app. You want people to be excited about it, but if they have to do a bunch of manual steps, they're going to be like, forget it. But you can actually streamline all of these processes, give your end users a great experience by using Azure AD Groups, and the next thing you know, it's like, hey, we've just rolled out an app. It should be on your phone. They click on the icon, the Power Apps icon on their phone, and boom, they have a license, they have access to the application, they have access to the environment, and everything's good. So take advantage of Azure AD Groups whenever possible. So that concludes the first part of this series. That was secure. In part 2, we are going to talk about how we can monitor Power Platform activities. So thanks for checking out this video, and we'll see you in an upcoming episode on this channel.